To get started though, let's just take a look at an example subscription here. Um, in Work 365, we have different types of subscriptions based on the billing type. So if you have a standard um, license-based subscription where you're managing quantities of licenses, the form you're going to use is the license-based subscription form. We have, if I just duplicate this, on the billing contract as well, you can also have your Azure subscriptions. Now, whether or not you should include those Azure subscriptions on the same contract as your license ones versus having a dedicated contract for those Azure subscriptions, we can have that discussion on another day because that leads into the billing best practices conversation. But just note, you can have usage-based subscriptions in the system as well for anything that's consumption-based. Typically, that would be Microsoft Azure, but you can take advantage of this type of subscription for other types of consumption. So keep that in mind. And then lastly, we have service-based subscriptions. Those are more for you could think of it as managed services. You could think of it maybe as support. It's just more from a billing type standpoint. This service-based subscription is going to be very similar to the license form in that you're managing quantities, but you're defining the subscription as a different type, basically, from a reporting standpoint. So similar to what I did on the billing contract form, I'm just going to review this license-based subscription form, looking at some of the fields here. You'll notice that the subscription is linked to the product because we have this product field here. So this product here, if I click this, it would actually take me to that product in the product catalog of CRM. I want to be clear though, after or when you create a new subscription and you've selected that product to do that, once the subscription is created and saved, the subscription becomes independent of that product. So when it comes to managing your pricing information, again, circling back on that discount discussion and managing discounts on a per subscription basis, say for X customer, you wanted to apply a 5% discount, and then B customer, you wanted to apply maybe a 3% discount. But your product itself is going to have a default price of maybe $12. What you can do on the subscription form is update the selling price to include that discount percent directly. So basically you're baking in that discount percent into the actual selling price. In the future, we will have the ability to have a discount field specifically on the subscription form, but right now the process is baking in the discount percent into the selling price itself. And then from a best practice standpoint, maybe you add a description of that percentage on the billing contract itself. Okay. Subscription name and friendly name. Basically, we pull these names from the product itself when you create that subscription from that product record. These on the invoice record, it's going to use, depending on the template that you have, it can use either the product name or the subscription name. So if you're unsure right now, I would say most users are probably going to have the invoice template that pulls the product name. If you'd ever wanted to change that, just reach out to us and we can send you the invoice template that includes the subscription name, basically. Okay, price list and sales unit. Essentially, in your catalog, you have what's called a price list, which is going to contain all of the selling prices for your subscriptions. And associated to those selling prices, you have these sales units here, which kind of define your invoicing as a metric, if you would. So because the sales unit is monthly, that means I'm invoicing the subscription on a monthly basis, which means from a calculation standpoint, it's going to take this selling price times this quantity monthly. But let's say I had, instead of a monthly sales unit here, let's say I put an annual sales unit, right? What would happen then, this becomes the annual selling price, not the monthly price. And if you have an annual billing contract, as an example, that annual billing frequency, it's going to take this as the annual price and multiply it by the quantity. That's it. Because this is the annual price. So it doesn't need to multiply it by 12 because this is the annual price because of the sales unit. Fatima, does that make sense? Hopefully that makes sense.
Yeah, it
If you
does.
wanted to clarify anything, just feel free to hop in. I'm gonna actually switch this back to monthly though, for now. Okay, let's see. So you notice you will have your selling price here and your cost price, and then the difference between these two is basically going to be your gross margin percent. Your revenue is going to be a calculation of your selling price times your quantity. And this is your monthly revenue, to be clear. So this is your, yeah, it's basically the revenue you have on a per month basis. And then you can have currency defined on your subscriptions as well. Product class, this is more of a way to classify the type of subscription in a different way from a reporting standpoint, but this also becomes relevant with accounting system integration and the sales incentives in Work 365. So helpful related to those various items. I do recommend adding your product classes if you don't already have them. Note that your product class you can actually define on the product form. So when you create that subscription from that product, it would populate the product class automatically for you. And then we kind of dive into the section here. I'm going to skip to parent subscription. This is going to be relevant when you have bundles in the system. So say you wanted this, I mean, currently this is an independent subscription, but say you wanted to add the subscription to a bundle. What I could do is look up another subscription that I'm going to say is the parent, meaning it's going to be the billable line item on that invoice. I could select it here and it would add it to that bundle basically. Then you have billable status. Again, this is more relevant when you have bundles, but you can specify whether a subscription is billable or not here, meaning is it going to be invoiced as a billable item or not. So if you have a bundle and it's non-billable, you're basically saying we're going to roll up the pricing here up to the parent subscription. Versus if you do have that parent and you leave it as billable, this technically becomes an add-on then at that point. I think maybe we can have a discussion on bundles in more depth in a future training session, but just an overview of that parent subscription field there. Is trial, this is going to be relevant when you actually provision trials, which are going to be specific SKUs with their own part numbers. So if it is a trial, this would actually say a yes. When it comes to provisioning new trials, there's a process that you would follow. We have an article on how to do that. We can also review that if people are interested, but that's what that field does basically. And then I've pointed this out already, but basically your license quantity is going to be managed here. So if you had a license request to, up the licenses a couple, basically you'd put in the total license count here. and then you'd save it, and then that's it. There are order fields here. You can take advantage of these, but I think I'll discuss these in more depth on a different call. But basically, if you enter information here, it's going to store in the changelog record, which I will review also in a minute. Allow end user modification. This is going to be relevant to the self-service portal, so not going to review it in detail right now. Billing details on the left. Like I mentioned before, each subscription is going to be linked to the CRM account. So thinking back on those provider accounts that I reviewed earlier, and that connection between the tenant and the CRM account and the subscription, it's through the CRM account. So that provider account is actually really key in establishing that connection. And then we also have the billing contract record, effective start date. Basically, this is reflecting when the subscription actually started. Billing type, this is going to align to your form. So whatever form type you have, that's going to be your billing type. Is taxable. Again, this is relevant to taxes, which is a different conversation. So we'll just kind of leave it at that. Provider details. Okay, so thinking back on the provider discussion that we had earlier, this is an example of an automatic provider. So when you make subscription quantity changes, the provisioning takes place automatically. If I were to look at a different subscription, say this one, this is an example of a subscription that has a do nothing provider. This is because both it is part of a bundle. It's actually the parent subscription of a bundle. And B, it's more of a service-based item. Therefore, there's nothing that needs to physically be provisioned. Again, that's just thinking back on that provider. That's why the do nothing is part of the name, because there literally means you don't need to action any provisioning. And then let's see, this would be an example of a manual provider. This should be something else. We'll make this Ingram. Okay, so you could think of this, maybe this is like a third-party vendor subscription or a subscription with a different distributor, or it's it could even be your own IP-based subscription. And if you have a license management system, you can make yourself the manual provider when you're provisioning those licenses. But basically, when you're managing the license quantities, things like that, there's a process you'd follow to not only physically assign that license, but update the changelog record. That process we will review in another training session, but just kind of reviewing that provider field here. Okay, let's go back to the subscription we were on before. Provider account. So the provider accounts I mentioned earlier, those are now, this is a fairly new field, but those are now linked on the subscription form as of version 3.1, I believe. Fatima, correct me if I'm wrong on that. So users currently on 3.0, if you want this provider account to be on your subscription form, just upgrade to 3.1, and those should get updated automatically for you. Mm-hmm. But basically, we're saying on this subscription belongs to this provider account because it's connected to that tenant in Partner Center. This comes into play more so when you have multiple tenants for the same customer. So you can specify which tenant you want that subscription to align to, basically. Then we have provisioning frequency. You'll notice this is actually a locked field. That's because when you create a new subscription and then save it, it becomes locked, so you can't change the status after that. But the provisioning frequency is basically going to reflect with your provider how frequent that subscription is going to be provisioned. So with Microsoft Partner Center, at least, you have two options, or technically three options. One would be an annual provisioning frequency. One is monthly, as shown here. One could be a non-recurring item, meaning you're provisioning something up front for the full cost, and one would be trial for any trial licenses. If you ever come to a point where you realize you need to change this, for direct CSP partners, you'd have to go into Partner Center to do that. Note when you are creating new subscriptions, though, monthly is going to be your default frequency. Then you have your subscription ID. This is for direct CSP users, as an example, this is the actual ID on their subscription in Partner Center that has synced to Work 365. Part number, this is going to be the part number associated with that product from the provider price list, basically. So on the Microsoft price list, this is that part number for this product. Let's see, manufacturer, again, thinking about the manufacturer discussion we had earlier. Microsoft, you can have as a manufacturer and a provider, but some, in the example of like an indirect CSP partner, right, you could have an Microsoft product like Azure Active Directory, but you are selling that product because you're working with a distributor, right? So in that case, your manufacturer would be Microsoft and your provider might be Crayon or Ingram or Synex, right? So though, just making sure we're distinguishing that the difference between the two. And then we have commitment end date here. Basically, this is a way for you to define the price end date. So when you, at least in the CSP program, when you are provisioning a new subscription, that customer is committed to that price for X amount of time. If it's a standard SKU, that's usually 12 months, but maybe if it's a special price SKU, say it's a discounted SKU for X months, maybe 6 months or so, and then after that period, it becomes the full price again. Whatever the case is, you can reflect that price commitment here. And then I'd recommend even tracking that commitment end date field. Auto renew, a lot of users have questions about this, but this is more a field that reflects Partner Center. This field, to be honest, doesn't really do anything. So you can put it to yes if that makes you feel better or makes you more comfortable. But even if this were no, the system would still renew a subscription, at least regarding direct CSP partners, because in Partner Center, it's set to auto renew, right? Okay. I think that's about it on the subscription form. When it comes to license-based subscriptions, note that you have what are called license changelog records. These are basically a way to identify the history of a license changelog, or sorry, the history of a subscription and all of those license changes that are made. So you can see I've, on this sandbox environment, I've made various changes. I've even had different subscription events here. So I deactivated the subscription at one point and then I reactivated it. And then I've had license update records. Basically, your subscription event here can be defined by these changelogs. Quantity, this is pretty self-explanatory, but I just wanted to communicate that this is basically your audit trail of all of those license changes, and they really become important when it comes to invoicing, because the invoices themselves are going to use these changelog records to calculate the proration of a midterm change, right? So say you added 8 licenses on June 25th. That means there are X number of days left in the billing cycle that you can invoice for from a prorated standpoint, right? So these changelog records become key for that purpose. And I want to communicate when it comes to license changelog management, Please don't delete these records or deactivate them really. Again, it's the audit history that you have, and if you were to delete or deactivate it, you're basically removing that history. And it can complicate things from an invoicing standpoint, because if the change log is not there, then it can't be invoiced. Thus, there is a potential of revenue leakage, basically. So we have a report that can help you track this information. It's a license changelog mismatch report. I'm sure many of you have seen notifications from Fatima recently. She's been reaching out, helping out a lot on that front. But we'll do a deep dive on that report in a future training session. But just please keep in mind, don't delete your changelogs. And then going back to the subscription form, like I mentioned before, we have these order fields here. So when you make a quantity change and then you populate information in the order fields, that information gets stored on the changelog record. Now, these particular changelog records, these were made from the self-service portal because the order source says portal. Right, so the provisioning took place on the portal side, and then it stored that information in the changelog record for you. Similarly, say you were to make a quantity change in Partner Center directly, or maybe a subscription was originally provisioned in Partner Center, and then it's synced to Work 365. In that case, it would say the order source is provider, because it's synced from that provider record, or provider source. But again, this is all relevant to just doing an overview of the application. I think really quick, it would be helpful to look at a usage subscription really quick. So I'm just going to dive into Azure a little bit here at a high level. Most of these fields are going to be the same, so I'm not going to reiterate any of those, but there is one key difference, and that the Azure, or basically the usage-based subscription form, does not have a quantity field or a flat selling price field. That's because Azure, or this form, tracks consumption. So I'll show an example of that consumption in a minute, but basically you do have a markup percent field, so that the system will apply this markup percent against your consumption when it generates the invoice. Okay, we do also have what's called a consumption threshold. This isn't to physically stop consumption per se, it's more to track how far along a customer has burned through consumption in any given billing cycle. So say you put 5,000 as the consumption limit, then you're going to basically, when the consumption gets created in the system, you're going to have a threshold status percent here. So say if you've burned through $3,000 estimated dollars of consumption, then your threshold status is going to update, and say you're only, I don't know, a week and a half into your billing cycle. Well, that's a fairly high threshold status percent for the given billing cycle. And if you're tracking this information, you can basically use that to engage with your customer and figure out, or have a conversation with them about what's going on, right? Why are they burning through so much consumption? Having that discussion so that they are not surprised when they get that invoice and it's not a higher amount than they were expected. You're basically identifying that this is the threshold. Yeah, so hopefully that makes sense. And then let's see, current cycle consumption. This isn't the best example because this one doesn't actually, the subscription doesn't have at least any current consumption on it, but basically just summing up the estimated consumption in your current cycle. That's what this field is for. And then you have last known revenue. This is going to be the consumption of a prior billing cycle and the revenue associated to that cycle from the invoice. Product class, that's pretty much the same. Yeah, everything else is pretty much the same here. One additional thing to note for usage-based subscriptions, instead of license change log records, you have consumption records. So this is an example of the consumption. This particular subscription is actually an Azure Plan entitlement. I don't know how many users here are familiar with Azure Plan, but with Azure Plan, we basically pull the detailed consumption records so that we can track that on a per entitlement basis. So the summary records that you see here, this is actually the detailed consumption that is associated directly to this Azure entitlement. For classic or legacy Azure subscriptions, note this would be the monthly consumption provided by the provider invoice. And this is actually, you can see this is classic consumption because of the D invoice here. What else? Note for classic Azure, at least, you do have detail records, which it's basically pulling the consumption directly from the Azure tenant. And these detail records would pull in on like an hourly and daily basis. Note the pricing listed here would be estimated prices. Pricing is not finalized until Microsoft actually provides that reconciliation file. So note that detail records are not going to be visible for Azure Plan entitlement subscriptions. This is really old consumption. If I were to sort this, you wouldn't actually see any recent consumption, but just keeping that in mind, that there are two types of Azure subscriptions now. You have Legacy Azure, and then you have Azure Plan, where Azure Plan entitlement consumption, it's a little bit different in that it's just going to be your summary here and not your detailed records. Okay, and then as far as consumption goes, you would usually see a couple charts here. On the left, you'd have basically your most recent months of consumption from a usage standpoint, just kind of looking at it from a visual standpoint. And then you'd have a pie chart that basically breaks down the consumption as well by type.